and this webinar will be shared on the district YouTube channel for folks to share or to reference. So I welcome you all today. My name is Casey Weber, and I'm the Educational Coordinator for the Piscataquis County Soil and Water Conservation District. And I'm very happy to be hosting our two presenters today. They are extraordinary resource for us all. I'm so grateful to have them working with us. So we will be hearing from Jay Wasson and Dr. Jay Wasson and Dr. Sean Fravor from the University of Maine School of Forest Resources. Jay's going to get things started for us, but before I do so, we constructed this event into two parts. So today's part is a webinar. It's meant to give us all an opportunity to learn about this very complex concept of climate change and the impact on forest ecology. And we did it in this way to kind of give you this all the wealth of information now, and then we can apply it when we're at the law farm on Friday, so we can kind of deepen our understanding in that way. Now, you might be saying, Casey, why are you talking about Friday and not Thursday? Our field tour was originally scheduled for tomorrow from 5 to 7 p.m. at the law farm. It is going to rain, so we are moving it to Friday, 5 to 7 at the law farm. And I sent an email out this morning with that information, but I'll send a reminder email Friday morning with that information as well. So I am going to go ahead and just put one last thing. I want to thank our sponsors for this for this forestry series: Pleasant River Lumber, Forest Stewards Guild. Oh, sorry, I've got some people popping up in me. And Forest Stewards Guild, and the Maine Woodlands owners, and also obviously to our presenters. So the partnership between our sponsorship and our presenters have made this forestry series hugely successful. And with that said, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Jay.
The other programs that they offered, some of them were sold out already. Some of them there was a fee and then they were sold out. This was free.
And I'm going to go ahead and mute everybody. One last thing. I'm going to go ahead and mute folks. There is a chat feature. I know that there are a few people who are called in. If you have a question, you can interrupt if you need to, but you can also use the chat function at the top. So I'm going to go ahead for now and mute everybody, and we'll go from there. Go ahead, Jay.
Okay, thanks, Casey, and thanks.
So Jay, you're muted.
I think Casey muted me, maybe. We'll blame her. All right, thanks. Hi everyone, my name is Jay Wason. I'm an assistant professor at the School of Forest Resources here. I'm an ecophysiologist. I study trees and in particular how climate change directly impacts the functions of those trees. So I'm going to get us started today thinking at the tree and even the leaf level, how climate change impacts trees. And then we'll be scaling up a little bit when we start talking with Sean after that, where he's going to move into kind of forest level carbon discussion. All right, so today we're going to cover a little bit of ground in my part of the presentation. We'll start out by discussing my weight. I'll explain what I mean by that in a minute. Then we're going to be learning how plants use photosynthesis and respiration to acquire energy and to grow. We're going to learn why water is so critically important for plants and trees, even in Maine. We're going to talk about some of the key changes that we're expecting in the climate system in Maine and how those are expected to impact plants. And then we'll introduce a little bit about how trees grow both taller and wider and kind of the biology behind that. So talking about my weight first. So where does my mass come from? Well, my mass comes from consuming food and breaking that food down to release the energy that I use to be awake right now and be talking to you all. And I also break those molecules down into other molecules that I can use to build other parts of my body. And that allows me and the cells in my body to do work. And so that's the key process in my metabolism. But hopefully you all know this. Why do I breathe? Does anybody know why I breathe? To bring in oxygen, right? We have oxygen that comes in, and we have to use that oxygen in some way to break down those molecules that I'm talking about. And then I also exhale some stuff. I exhale primarily carbon dioxide and water. And I told you I was going to be talking about trees today, but this is actually a process that's actually happening in trees and other living organisms in the forest as well. And so this is a good starting point for us to learn the first of two chemical equations I'm going to make you learn today. So you didn't realize this was going to be a chemistry class, but it's not going to be too intense, I promise. So the equation we're talking about here and what you're all doing right now is respiring or respiration. And so there you're taking sugar or some other carbohydrate or molecule, whatever you had for lunch, and you're breaking that down and you're using oxygen in the process to break it down. That's why you breathe in the oxygen. And then you release carbon dioxide, water, and energy. And so that energy, your body uses that energy to heat itself and to do other work, and it's releasing carbon dioxide and water. So that's the process of respiration. We may think we're very unique, but we're not actually, because plants are just like us in a lot of ways, and one of which is that they also respire. And so they break down food and they release the energy from that food in order to do work. The work they do seems different than the work we do. We can move ourselves around, but they work for a plant is things like growing, maintaining cells, keeping things alive, moving things around inside the plant body, for example. So plants also have to break down molecules to do that. The difference is where they get the food. So instead of like us where we consume food, plants actually produce their own. And that's what the process that you all should be familiar with, photosynthesis. So that's the cool thing about plants. And that's the second equation that I'm going to make you learn today. And that's the end of it. One of the nice things about the photosynthetic equation you may notice is it's actually just the flip side of the respiration equation. So here, instead of releasing carbon dioxide and water and energy, plants are using photosynthesis to take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. They're using a little bit of water, and they're using some light energy from the sun in order to produce sugars and other substances in their body and releasing oxygen in the process. And so we all benefit from this because we like the oxygen aspect, because we then need to use that oxygen for our own respiration. But the purpose of photosynthesis for plants is to produce their own food. So instead of eating food, they're producing their own and then burning that and breaking that down. What this means is there's a balance between this photosynthesis and respiration of plants. So in sunlight, plants uptake more carbon dioxide by photosynthesis than they're actually releasing from the respiration process. And that's what allows the plant to have a positive carbon balance and to grow. So we'll practice with a few more of those concepts in a few minutes. That brings us to the question of where does the matter in a tree come from? What actually produces, is what is the wood in a tree actually made of, or where does it come from? And what I like to ask my students, I teach intro biology classes here at the University of Maine, is, well, what do you give your houseplants? And a lot of people say, well, I give them fertilizer, I give them water. And so they may assume at face value that a lot of the mass of the plant comes from those things. But what many of you know is actually that the mass of a plant primarily comes from the air. And so here we're talking about the dry matter. Imagine a piece of firewood, for example. If you look at the dry mass of the tissues of those plants, you find that 90% of the dry mass comes from carbon and oxygen, and those are derived from CO2 molecules from the atmosphere. So 90% of the mass of this giant sequoia tree came right out of the air, basically, which is pretty cool when you kind of pause on that for a few minutes, right? It's pretty amazing. The water that you feed your plants, only about 6% of that goes into the mass of the plant. So a very, very small proportion of the mass of the plant is water. And then fertilizer, what people typically think of when they think of plants and what they need to grow, that makes up just the remaining couple of percentage points of the mass of the plant. So most of the mass of the plant comes from the air, which is pretty cool. So let's review briefly humans versus plants in this discussion of respiration versus photosynthesis. So humans and most other non-plant organisms, and this is where we're kind of starting to broaden our discussion to thinking about how a forest functions, because it has all kinds of other non-plant organisms in it. We eat our food and then we respire to release that energy, and that releases carbon dioxide. Whereas plants, they make their own food, and in the process, they uptake carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, but then they also respire to do work like grow and keep themselves alive. And so that causes them to release carbon dioxide as well. So they're both taking it in and releasing it. So to synthesize this, we can look at a graph on the right-hand side here, just a conceptual idea of what happens to a plant and a human over the course of a day in terms of their carbon dioxide exchange with the atmosphere. So a positive value here would mean that that organism is taking carbon dioxide into its body, and a negative value would mean that that organism is releasing carbon dioxide back to the atmosphere. So I'm going to pause for a minute, actually, and I want you to think about, if you were to draw a line on this graph for humans, where would you expect that line to fall on this graph? And I'll just pause and then I'll show you. So since humans are they're consuming food and then releasing carbon dioxide, you might expect something like this. So here you can see humans are always releasing carbon dioxide, and any other non-plant organisms are primarily just releasing carbon dioxide. And maybe during an active part of the day, you're releasing a little bit more carbon dioxide than at night when you're resting. So I'm sure that you all got that right. Now take a moment and think about how you would draw a line for plants. What would you expect on here if we drew a line for a tree over the course of a day? So Casey go kind of like this, right? Everybody does this, but what's important about this is that the height of where you draw that line. And so what you can see actually is plants in the darkness around midnight, they're actually below that zero line, and that's that respiration. So that's at night when the plant is not photosynthesizing. It's actually burning sugars and other molecules through respiration to keep itself alive and releasing carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. So that here is showing plants releasing carbon dioxide. And then at some point, once there's enough sunlight, photosynthesis ramps up and there's a net uptake of carbon dioxide for those plants. And so there's really this balance between respiration and photosynthesis in plants today. And all these values above zero for plants, that all represents carbon sequestration that can go into the storage pools of those organisms or used to grow. That's all excess carbon that those plants can take advantage of. I love to say this sentence, especially when I'm teaching my students about photosynthesis. Life on Earth is totally dependent on past photosynthesis, which is pretty amazing when you think about it. And just a couple of examples of how this equation carries through into our day-to-day lives. Any food you eat primarily is a result of either its own photosynthesis from that organism, or if you're eating meat or something, that is derived from an organism that had to eat something that at some point photosynthesized to sequester that, or to capture that energy from the sun. The fossil fuels that we burn are all derived from past photosynthesis that occurred on the planet. The wood products that we use, that's all derived from past photosynthesis of trees. And then we also benefit from the waste product of photosynthesis, which is the oxygen. And we talked about how oxygen is important for us in order to be able to respire. So photosynthesis is a hugely important process, and we can actually see it playing out in really, really large scales. And so some of you may be familiar with this graphic. On the x-axis here, we have year going back to the late 1950s. And on the y-axis, we have the CO2 concentration of the atmosphere. And this is actually measured out in Hawaii, one of the most kind of pure sources that we think is a good representation of global average atmospheric concentrations of CO2. And you can see there's a long-term increase over the course of this time period. And there's also annual fluctuations up and down. So that long-term increase is primarily driven by the burning of fossil fuels, which we're all familiar with, and the release into the atmosphere. But there's also these annual dips going up and down every single year. And what I want you to think about for a second, and you can use this little video that's playing here in the corner, do those annual dips in the carbon dioxide concentration, do you think they represent the summertime, or do you think they represent the winter time for in this case? So just pause for a second and think for yourself. And so what you can see as you watch this little video, as the snow line retreats here, you'll see the northern hemisphere begin to green up. And that's the summertime for the northern hemisphere. I should have mentioned northern hemisphere specific, summer and winter there, sorry. And at that point in time, we have a lot of vegetation that's conducting photosynthesis. And I like to think of that as a big inhale of photosynthesis for those organisms, or a big inhale of carbon dioxide for all those plants. And that causes a slight reduction in the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere. And so these dips are actually representing summertime conditions when the plants are sequestering a lot of that carbon dioxide. And then in the winter time, when most of the vegetation on Earth goes dormant, as you can see in that video, then the carbon dioxide concentration tends to rise back up again. So even this small scale process of photosynthesis, we can see has really large scale global implications. So in addition to photosynthesis being important for carbon, it's also extremely important for water. And this is something that we really focus on the research in my lab. I'm not going to ask you to learn all the names on this diagram, but here you're looking at a cross section of a leaf. And so we've got all these different cells inside a leaf that are adapted to conduct photosynthesis maybe, or to bring water into the leaf, or to release carbon, or to move sugars out of the leaf to other parts of the plant. And what we know is we have to get carbon dioxide from outside the leaf inside the leaf. So that's carbon dioxide diffusing into the leaf so that the plant can then conduct photosynthesis in its cells. But what we find when we do that, we have to open these small pores on the bottoms of the leaves called stomata. And when you open those small pores to let the carbon dioxide diffuse in, a whole bunch of water diffuses out because the inside of a leaf is wet. And what you actually find is for about every carbon dioxide molecule you bring in, you lose 400 molecules of water to the atmosphere. So it's a hugely inefficient process from that perspective. You waste a lot of water in order to bring in carbon dioxide. The analogy I like to give sometimes is imagine walking around with your mouth open. So you can imagine that's to bring in the carbon dioxide on a hot, dry summer day in the desert or something. Your mouth is going to dry out, right? So you're losing a lot of water in that way. And that's why water is so important for plants, actually. And so we can take this equation of photosynthesis and start thinking about carbon dioxide in water. And you actually have to add about 24,000 or 2,400 water molecules to this equation because those are lost to the atmosphere. So the 6 in this equation are just used in the chemistry, but you also have another 2,400 that are lost to the atmosphere just to make these 6 glucose molecules. So this is why water is hugely important for plants. And a forest tree in Maine, for example, can lose upwards of 100 gallons of water in a single hot, dry day. And that's just by water evaporating out to the atmosphere. This is why, even though water only only contributes to about 6% of the mass of the dry matter in a tree, this is why you have to water your plants regularly in your house. It's because most of that water transpires back into the atmosphere of your house, for example, because that plant has to open all of its little mouths to try to bring in the carbon dioxide. And when it does that, that water evaporates out to the atmosphere. So this is why water is so important. All right, so let's think about, from this perspective of photosynthesis and respiration and all these things, let's think about what is the best time of day for photosynthesis. I showed you an equation for photosynthesis. It requires carbon dioxide, water, and sunlight. And so we may think about some of these limiting factors and when we'll have the best conditions for photosynthesis. Here I'm showing a graph of just the time over the course of a day from morning into the afternoon. And we have increasing solar radiation peaking in the middle of the day. So that's the most sunlight, and then decreasing in the afternoon. And so what you might think here is that the middle of the day is the best time for photosynthesis for plants. That's ideal. But what we find when we actually measure photosynthesis on a lot of plants around here, so this is it represents photosynthesis here. And these are for red maple trees growing right here on campus, actually. What we find is photosynthesis actually plummets in the middle of the day. So exact opposite of what you might expect. And this is actually in conditions, it's a nice kind of sunny, moderate day in July. There was plenty of moisture available in the soil, but these plants were not taking advantage of those midday sunny conditions. The reason is the air and the atmosphere around them. We talked about the drying effect of the air, pulling water molecules out of those plants. And so you have hot and dry air in the middle of the day. It causes the rate of water loss from those leaves to be so fast that they would rather close those small pores in their leaves to conserve water than they would risk the leaves drying out and dying, for example. And so it's a trade-off. So they can't conduct photosynthesis anymore because they can't bring in carbon dioxide, but they're able to conserve water. So this is what our trees in Maine are actually doing all throughout the summer, and this is why water is still critically important for plants, even in a relatively wet state like Maine. So let's talk a little bit now about how the climate's actually changing in Maine. I know most of you are familiar with some of these key changes, so I'm not going to get into too many of the details here, but we are expecting it to get warmer in the state of Maine by several degrees. We're also expecting drier air, so that relates to the evaporation pressure on those leaves and water loss from those leaves. You may hear about and see that we're expecting these slight increases in precipitation across the state on the order of 1 to 8% increase in precipitation. And many people say, oh, well, that's great. That's good for plants because they need water. But it also comes along with that precipitation becoming more episodic. So we'll have more likely have flooding events and more likely to have periods of drought as well. And we're also expecting reduced snowpack, which changes the hydrological regime, especially in the springtime for a lot of the forests in Maine. So these are some of the changes that we're expecting for the climate. But sometimes it's kind of challenging to think about how that impacts a tree. So one of the ways that we do this is by looking at the suitable habitat for, or the suitable climate conditions for specific tree species. So here we're looking for red spruce, which is a common conifer in the state. And on the left-hand map, this is the current potential distribution of red spruce. So where it could live all across the northeastern United States, you can kind of ignore the difference between pink and green here. Any colored cell is a place where red spruce theoretically could grow. And then they can project these models into the future to show that by 2060, this is where we project both pink and green, both projecting where we expect red spruce to grow. And if you look at the difference there, the red colors here are now where you should pay attention to. This is where we're expecting to lose suitable habitat for spruce. And this is just about 40 years from now. So these are big changes that we're expecting with the climate that's coming up. So the question really becomes, well, but how? How does that actually impact the trees? Here we've talked a little bit about suitable climate, but what's actually happening in the tree to potentially impact this? So there's two key ways I wanted to talk about today that climate change can impact trees. The first is that climate change can limit the environmental conditions that are suitable for carbon uptake. So we saw that midday decline because it was hot and dry conditions middle of the day. So that could increase the likelihood of experiencing those conditions, for example. If we create these conditions where the plant can't take up as much carbon as it could normally, that's going to result in lower growth, lower reproduction, and lower carbon storage that plant could save those sugars and use those later. All of that can combine into a reduced ability for that plant to be competitive in these competitive forest environments. It also can make it more susceptible to other stressors as well. You also can have more extreme climate scenarios that can lead to the death of those tissues really drastically. And so the insides of plants are very wet because they need the water inside their cells to conduct all of the metabolism that's important for them. And so extreme environmental conditions can actually lead to the drying and death of leaves and the cambial tissues, which are the tissues that are critical for the growth of the plant. And that can lead to relatively rapid mortality in some cases as well. So those are two key ways how climate change can directly impact how a tree functions. And I wanted to wrap up briefly talking about how trees actually grow. So now that they have this carbon in their bodies, they have fixed these sugars, now they can allocate them to growth. And so this is a classic exam question that when you learn about how trees grow. So I've got this diagram here. Let's say that we walked up to a tree and you hammered a nail into a tree, and you come back 10 years later, you've got these four options, A, B, C, and D. They're essentially showing, does the nail actually move up the tree over time? And does the nail actually become engulfed by the tree, or does it stay at the same depth in the tree if you come back 10 years later? And so you may all have some experience with this if you spent some time in the woods and seen nails in trees. What you'd actually expect here is option D. And so the nail would remain at the same height in the tree, and it would begin to become engulfed by the tree. And that right there completely synthesizes the two key ways that plants grow, which is primary growth and secondary growth. So let's briefly just look at those. So primary growth is the extension of plants. That's how they get taller or longer. And secondary growth is the widening of plants. So that's how they get wider in diameter. And that's critical for the growth of wood. Primary growth happens at shoot tips and at root tips, whereas secondary growth happens at these cambium layers. So here we're looking at a cross section through a 3-year-old woody stem. We've got 3 years of xylem growth. Xylem is the wood tissue. And then you also have the bark tissue out here. There's a thin layer of cells right at this location called the cambium that produces new growth rings. It produces the new wood tissue. And that means that the outermost ring in that wood tissue is the most recently formed ring. And as you move your way further and further in towards the center of the plant, you're identifying xylem that was produced longer and longer ago. This manifests itself with some interesting pictures, I think. And so here, this is like a nice, beautiful overlook with a swing hanging from a tree. But you don't have to go out to this swing every year and adjust the height of it because it doesn't get carried further and further from the ground, right? Because we know that plants are getting longer from the tips of their shoots. And so that's part of why you don't have to adjust your tire swing hanging in your backyard. So that's primary growth occurring at the shoot tips. It's not like growing from the base of the tree and pushing it up. That's why that nail doesn't move higher in the tree. And also some interesting examples of secondary growth. So this is actually a bullet that was embedded in a tree. And so it hit a tree at one point in the past. And you can see the scar here. But then you can notice there's a series of growth rings after that bullet because that plant is growing wider in diameter from that cambium layer, which is just inside the bark. So that's how it's getting wider. You also see these interesting examples of sidewalks being lifted up by trees. And what's actually happening there is after those roots are conducting secondary growth, they get thicker and thicker and thicker, and that begins to lift up the root system, the sidewalk system that's above them. Okay, so today we talked about my weight to start things off. We learned how plants use photosynthesis and respiration to get energy and to grow. We talked about why water is so critical for plants. We reviewed some of the key aspects of climate change we're expecting in Maine. And we were introduced to how trees grow taller and wider. Hopefully that's going to set the stage for a nice discussion for those of you that are able to join us in the field on Friday. We're going to be looking at some examples of some of these things out in the woods, and I'll be demonstrating some aspects of physiology and how we can measure things like photosynthesis and how that results in different patterns of growth in the field. Okay, that's all I've got for my presentation. I think we've got a few minutes for questions. And we can shift over to Sean too, whenever.
Thank you, Jay. Yeah, if anyone has any questions. I didn't see anything in the chat. I really appreciate all that background because I really think it will help when we have our discussion on Friday. So
great. Well,
great.
we can save it for a discussion with Sean at the end too. So
yeah. So if I'm not seeing anything, so I can have Sean, if you want to take your presentation down, Jay, and I'll have Sean start his. There we go.
Okay, so can you folks see my presentation and hear my voice? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, so I, for some reason, just see Jay's image here. I wonder if I can.
I think if you give it just a second on your end, it will come on up. If you, how's it looking for you now, Sean?
Yeah, I don't see anyone. Give me a second.
Sure.
All right. Okay, so Casey, I can see you, but nobody else, but that's okay. And you folks can hear me and see my screen?
Yes, I'm seeing nodding. I'm sorry that you can't see anyone, Sean, but they are nodding that they can see everything. So I think
Okay.
you're good to go.
So they're not nodding off to sleep, they're nodding in affirmation. Yeah. All right. So again, I'm Sean Fravor. I'm an associate professor of forest ecology here at the University of Maine. I'm a close colleague of Jay's. So when Jay and I planned this, we thought it'd be convenient or maybe informative to follow up his presentation with some information on forest carbon, pools and fluxes. So that's what I'll be talking about today, pools and fluxes. So let's start with an overview of the terrestrial carbon cycle. And the cycle begins, as Jay pointed out, with photosynthesis, although because it's a cycle, it has no beginning and end, but photosynthesis is a good place to start the discussion. And can you folks see my cursor? Do you see a red dot? Yes, thank you. So again, if we look at these white arrows, these indicate fluxes, that is the movement of materials, CO2 in particular, from the atmosphere into the terrestrial system. And all of that, as Jay pointed out, all of that carbon enters the system through photosynthesis. It leaves the system by plant respiration, which Jay mentioned, but also decomposition of organic matter, dead organic matter. One thing I really like about this figure is that historically, if you look at the numbers, and again, the numbers maybe aren't terribly important, the units aren't important, but what this represents is globally, in a typical year, there's about 120 gigatons, that's a billion tons of carbon that enters the terrestrial system. During that same year, about half of that's lost by plant respiration, another half to decomposition, that is the respiration of soil microbes. So historically, these were in balance, 120 coming in, 60 leaving, 60 leaving. But because of human activities, we're now adding an extra 9 gigatons per year to the atmosphere. So the system is no longer in balance, as you folks are aware of. Maybe I'm diverging here just for a minute, but when I interviewed for this faculty position about 10 years ago, the search committee realized that I worked on, in part, on this process, decomposition, and some of the search committee didn't like that. Why are you worried about decomposing organic matter? We're interested in growing trees. But I pointed out that this value of 60 is about 7 times higher than what we're emitting by fossil fuels. So this is clearly not an insignificant number or insignificant process. So I think I convinced them, they hired me, and now here I am. Right? So there's some limitations to this figure, but I still like using it. So when we talk about the forest carbon cycle, we're talking about pools and fluxes. So the pools are simply locations where carbon is stored. So in this image, we have one pool is leaves, another is trunks and branches, woody debris, tree roots, and soils. So those are the pools in this diagram. The fluxes are shown by these arrows. Again, photosynthesis and respiration. Right? One thing I'll point out early on, that the largest, in most cases, the largest pool is, the largest carbon pool is in the soil, right? Here it's 45% of the total. Often it's much higher than that. That's really variable from system to system, but in general, the take-home message is there's a lot of carbon in soils. Yeah, not to confuse things, but there are alternative carbon pools. Some researchers recognize different pools. So in the previous image, one pool was stems and branches, leaves, roots, and so forth. What's probably more common is this list of pools. This is what I use, this is what my collaborators use, right? Living trees, standing dead trees, understory, woody debris, forest floor, and soils. Here's another breakdown, right, of above ground biomass, below ground biomass, and so forth. So it doesn't matter which of these categories, sets of categories we use, as long as researchers we're capturing all the carbon, right? So we're not missing carbon in some pool that we're not accounting for. Yeah, again, not to make it complicated, but these pools are often referred to as reservoirs, stocks, or stores. So these are all synonyms: pools, reservoirs, stocks, or stores. Yeah, this is a system I worked in Minnesota, red pine stands, and here, just to make the point, the carbon pools I typically recognize are living trees, standing dead trees, coarse woody debris. I work a lot with woody debris, the forest floor, which is this leaf litter, and the humus that's right underneath it, and then the soil underneath that. So this system doesn't have much of an understory. The understory would be these small saplings you see here. So the understory is typically seedlings and saplings of trees, shrubs, and herbaceous material. So again, I'm talking about carbon pools in the forest. So Jay covered this. How much carbon is in wood? So if we were in person, I would quiz you on this since Jay just went over this, but if this guy is carrying 5 pounds of firewood, how much of that is actually carbon? And it's about 50%, right? In other words, half of the dry weight of wood is carbon, and that, as Jay and I have been saying, is being brought in from the atmosphere via photosynthesis. So when I teach this, I've found it's informative to go over briefly how we measure these pools. How do we find out how much carbon is in each of these pools when we're doing a carbon budget? So I'm going to go through these 5 pools one at a time, just to briefly explain how we measure these things. So let's start with trees, right? Here in Maine, we typically use some equations that were developed by Harold Young, who was a professor here at the university back in the 1970s. And here's an example of how we use these equations for red maple. And this is quite simple, it's quite convenient. And what we start with is a measurement of the diameter of the tree. And this is very easy to do. You see, it's simple, it's fun. This guy has a big smile on his face, right? So we're just measuring the diameter of the tree. If we know the diameter, we can plug that into this equation, right? So it's 1.18 plus 2.37 times the natural logarithm of the diameter, right? So it's fairly straightforward. And then once we know the biomass, as I've said, the carbon mass is about 50% of the biomass. So just multiply the biomass by 0.5. And now we know the carbon mass in this red maple tree. This is extraordinary. So this is the carbon mass in the stem, the branches, the leaves, and the roots. And we know this from some detailed work that Harold Young did many decades ago. So now we know the carbon mass of this one tree. We do this for all the trees on our stand or in our plots, add those together, and we get the carbon mass for trees. A very straightforward and convenient. Woody debris is a little bit more complicated. So there are several ways to do this. What I'm showing here is measuring the dimensions of logs. From those dimensions, we can determine the volume of that log. Also, when we do our inventories, we assign those logs to one of 5 decay classes. And if we know the species of the log and its decay class, we can look up a density value in this publication. This is a publication by the U.S. Forest Service. I use this all the time. Excellent use of U.S. taxpayers' money, very useful document. So now we got the volume from field measurements. We get the density from this publication, multiply those two together, we get the biomass of that log, right? And again, we multiply by 0.5 to get the carbon mass, right? So that's how we get woody debris. For the understory, unfortunately, this has to be done with what we call destructive sampling, right? So here I've put down a frame that's just made of PVC pipe. It's 1 square meter. And we actually clip with pruning shears all the living material within this frame. So we clip this plant, and so forth, put that in a bag, bring it back to the laboratory. We dry it and weigh it, right? And again, multiply that dry mass by 50%, and we get the mass of the understory in that 1 square meter. But here's the important point. We don't do this just in 1 square meter. If we wanted to do this, for instance, at the law farm, we would probably have scores of these frames, maybe 100 of these frames to capture that, that variability. So then roughly in the center of each one of these frames, we place a smaller frame. And here we scoop up the forest floor. So I'm talking about the leaf litter and the humus. And again, we return that to the lab. We dry it, weigh it, multiply by 50%. And now we get the carbon mass in the forest floor. Now here's where it gets difficult. This is all pretty straightforward until we get to the soils. Now this becomes really complicated and it's extremely labor intensive and time consuming. So here we have to dig soil pits like this guy's doing. We collect all the volume of the soil to a standard depth, although in reality there is no standard depth. We determine the depth pretty much in every study we do. We return that soil to the greenhouse or wherever we dry it out, we grind it up, and then we use some lab equipment to determine the carbon content of that soil, right? So all this is straightforward except for the soil. The soil is more difficult. So one of our former PhD students did extensive work doing exactly what I just showed you at the Penobscot Experimental Forest, which is across the river from our university. And this is, as an example, results from one of his stands, the stand I'm looking at here. So in this stand, he found 168 megagrams of carbon per hectare, 13 megagrams of woody debris, forest floor, mineral soil, and so forth. So the total is 243, and I've converted that to English units. So this stand we're looking at here has 108 tons of carbon per acre. That sounds like a lot to me, and it is a lot, actually. One thing that's unusual about this stand is the relatively low amount of soil carbon, and the reason for that is these soils are very shallow and rocky, so there's just not a lot of soil and hence not a lot of carbon to account for. So there's just a pie chart showing the relative abundance of those carbon pools. Okay, so just to review, we just went over the various pools, right? So now we're going to shift to the fluxes. So how do we measure these fluxes, right? So let's start with photosynthesis. And I don't actually use these devices. Jay does, and Jay should probably explain these. But if I misspeak, he can clarify that afterwards. So what we do is, with one of these devices, we place a leaf within this chamber, just a small chamber, and this device monitors how much the change in CO2 and other metrics, but primarily CO2 concentrations within that chamber. So if we keep this chamber on this leaf for several minutes, we can monitor the change in CO2 within that chamber. That, of course, gives us estimate of photosynthesis, right? So again, CO2 is entering the forest via photosynthesis. It leaves the forest by respiration. Here we're talking about respiration of microbes that are in the soil. So the way we measure that is we place a PVC collar into the soil, and we use, actually this is the same device that I showed here in this previous, oops, the same device, but here we're monitoring CO2 flux coming out of this chamber, right? So this is something I do. I monitor CO2 flux from decaying logs. These are spruce logs at the Howland Research Forest. And again, we custom fit these collars to the curvature of the log. We seal the collars onto the log and come to this location every week or every 10 days and monitor the CO2 flux using instruments similar to what I just showed you in the previous diagrams. This is somewhat routinely done. We're also doing this on stumps, and this is not routinely done. We're one of the first research groups to do this. I hope I can explain this. We have stumps that were harvested at different times in the past. This is very recently cut stump. This stump was cut 8 years ago. This one was cut 32 years ago. And we have other stumps that were cut 2 years ago, 4 years ago, and so forth. So if we look at on the vertical axis, we have the emissions, that is the flux rate, the CO2 that's released from these stumps. Again, let me back up. The CO2 is the result of the respiration from wood decomposing fungi. These are fungi that reside in the stumps. They break down the carbon compounds in the stumps, and as they respire, they release CO2 to the atmosphere. What's fascinating about this is initially there's very low flux. That flux increases and reaches a peak, we think somewhere around 8 years, and then decreases afterwards, right? Again, we're talking about flux from woody material to the atmosphere. Okay, this is a whole different method. So up to this point, we've been talking about individual pools and fluxes from those individual pools. There's another method we use, and I hope I can explain this somewhat. It's called the eddy flux method. And this does not account for flux from individual pools. It monitors the exchange of CO2 between the atmosphere and the entire forest. So how does this work? As air moves through the forest, as the wind blows through the forest, it creates eddies, small eddies, as these arrows show. Some of these eddies are moving in a clockwise rotation, some are moving counterclockwise. What that means is some of the CO2 is moving up into the atmosphere and some's moving down from the atmosphere into the forest. So on top of these towers, there's a sensor that records the CO2 concentration about 10 times per second, right? So again, some of the CO2 is moving upward in the eddies, some is moving downward. If you look at the balance of that throughout a 1 hour period or an entire day or an entire year, you can determine if this forest is emitting more CO2 than it's taking in. And, oh yeah, I just want to put in a plug for the Howland Research Forest. This is one of those towers. This is about 30 miles north of our university. This is Holly Hughes, one of our research associates. This tower at Howland, I don't know if you folks know this, it's the second longest running eddy flux tower in the Americas. So the longest running tower is at Harvard Forest. We can never compete with Harvard, but we have the second longest running tower here in Howland. So this figure is real similar to something Jace showed you. In Jace's figure, we were looking at the carbon balance over a 24-hour period. And here we're looking at the carbon balance, again, for this whole forest on an annual basis. This is real data from 1996. So each one of these blue circles is the flux rate for that day. So there are 365 little circles on this figure. And if you follow this from January 1st through December 31st, you see during the winter and early spring, the forest is actually losing carbon, right? The carbon balance is below zero, it's negative. Why is that? It's because the trees are dormant, but yet the soil microbes are still active, so they're emitting some CO2 to the atmosphere. But once the soil thaws out and frees up the water, the trees become active again. They very quickly start taking in an enormous amount of carbon, and that continues throughout the growing season until the trees are dormant again and the forest switches back to a source. So for most of our healthy, productive forests in Maine, on an annual basis, they shift from a carbon source to a sink back to a source. The important thing is the sink strength is much greater than the source. So this is true. Fortunately, our forests function as sinks. They bring in more CO2 than they release. So shifting gears and wrapping this up, how do we assess tree growth rates? So I'm shifting gears a little bit here, but we do this from an increment core, right? We actually core into the tree with a hollow drill bit. We extract a small piece of wood from that tree, and from that piece of wood, we can look at the variability in the ring widths. I think a lot of you folks are familiar with this. If we have time on Friday afternoon, I will do this. I'll demonstrate in the field at the law farm how we do this, right? But it's a bit of a leap of faith. Again, we're looking at the year-to-year variability in ring width. I hope you folks can see how that might translate to carbon mass increments. So here in the vertical axis, we have sort of a stand level, an entire forest's carbon mass increment, and we can see how it changes from year to year. Some years have good, the forest has good growth, right? It has a higher increment. Some years it has lower increments and so forth. So this is something folks like Jay and I are interested in, what causes this year-to-year variability in carbon mass increment or forest productivity, I'll say. Okay, wrapping it up, just as a review, we covered mostly forest carbon pools and fluxes. And this is my final slide, so I suppose I can stop sharing. Okay. So that's all I had to say. If there are questions, either online here in the chat, Jay and I'll be glad to take them.
Yep, and I thank you, Sean, for that. I don't see any questions in the chat, and just like Sean said, you all can unmute yourself, ask any questions that you might have. And again, I'm looking forward to applying, seeing some of this applied on Friday. So
I have a question. Can you hear me?
yes.
Do you measure mycorrhiza, and how would that affect this whole thing? I mean, you're looking at the soils, or you're looking at mycorrhiza, and it goes a lot deeper and connects. How does that affect this whole thing?
I can start out with some comments and Jay can follow up. So, Greg, I work a lot with wood decomposition. Most mycorrhizal fungi are not wood decomposers. Some decompose wood in the very later stages of decay, so they do contribute to CO2 flux, right, at the later stages of wood decay. As you know, mycorrhiza are very important for tree growth and hence carbon mass increment and forest productivity in general. So maybe I'll turn it over to Jay if you want to clarify or correct anything I just said.
No, I think you're right. I mean, I always think about it from the tree's perspective, where the tree is actually contributing carbon to those fungi. So it changes that balance a little bit, but overall, I always try to explain that as a way for the plant to efficiently expand its root system. So you can think about it from the perspective of the mycorrhizal fungi as just an expanded root system. The plant's root system would have its own respiration cost to keep those roots alive. And this expanded mycorrhizal system, which is kind of functioning as a root system in some ways, also has its own respiration cost. It's just this interesting interface between those two organisms that changes the dynamic a little bit. But overall, in terms of kind of carbon and forest health, Sean, I think you're right. I mean, they're extremely important for the health of the forests and the trees, and their ability to acquire the water in particular, but also the nutrients that they need in order to build the leaves and conduct the photosynthesis that they need to during stressful environmental events and things like that. So does that clarify what you're wondering about, Greg?
I think so, but you're taking into account when you take your readings, the mycorrhiza, is it included in that? In other words, it's not outside of what you're measuring.
Yep. All right. So Greg, I think now I finally understand your question, I think. Right. When we account for carbon in soil, much of that carbon is fungal biomass. Right. So it is accounted for in our carbon budgets. Right. So when we assess carbon in the soil, we don't break it down by what was in the leaf litter, what originated with leaf matter or bacteria or insects or mycorrhizal fungi or whatever. It's the total organic carbon in the soil, and that would include carbon in mycorrhizal fungi.
Okay, thank you. Yeah.
Kind of
I
have
have
a question.
I have
Oh,
a
go
question.
ahead.
Sorry,
Yeah.
I'm Carol. I'm just wondering, how does a forest compare to other ecosystems like grassland as far as CO2 uptake?
That's a good question. So
I'm
do you
looking
want
to
to take that one,
Jay.
Sean? Yeah, I mean, so what it comes down to is so I don't study grassland, so I'll be speaking a little bit beyond my expertise here. But what we do study in forest ecosystems is how much leaf area we have in the forest, for example, and that relates oftentimes to the shade tolerance of the leaves. And so the forests in Maine have often a lot of shade tolerant species, so they can have lots and lots of layers of leaves, and so that provides a lot of photosynthetic area. When you move to a grassland system, most of those grasses are not shade tolerant. So you end up having a much smaller leaf area in those systems. And so I suspect that there's a lot less carbon sequestration happening on kind of a per acre basis there. But then they also are still perennial organisms, lots of times, that are storing that carbon kind of in these below ground structures as well. So they don't have these perennial woody stems above ground. And to tie back to the pools diagram that Sean was showing, now you don't have those big woody stems that were representing as much as like 40% of the carbon storage. There's probably, I would suspect, maybe a bit more in the soils, but I'm not quite sure about that in terms of percentage wise. Sean, do you have anything to add on that?
No, you explained it better than I did, as usual. But I agree with Jay that because there's less leaf area, the leaves are the factories for carbon, so there would be less carbon uptake by grasslands. But without a doubt, forests store more carbon because of the huge above ground tissues that Jay referred to.
That's a good question. I wanted to ask too, Sean, I was just looking at the one image that you had of that person kind of in that soil pit digging down there for carbon. You kind of hinted at this a little bit, but can you talk briefly about how the heck the carbon gets down there? Right, because we're like looking at leaves on the surface of the soil and stuff, and it all comes from the trees. But can you talk about, it's a huge pool of carbon in the soil, how it actually gets in there?
Well, almost all that carbon comes from organic matter. So it's, again, the result of photosynthesis. This organic matter breaks down and sort of percolates down into the mineral soil. Some of mineral soil can contain carbon if there's calcium carbonate, for instance, but most of the soil carbon originates from photosynthesis, the breakdown of organic matter, and the organisms and the fungi that feed on that decaying organic matter. I hope you agree with that, Jay.
Yeah, yeah, it's just kind of weird to think about that there's carbon that gets so far down into the soil. But once you start thinking about those organisms and deep roots and things like that, I think it starts to make more sense.
I wanted to ask a question, and when of course, I in my position, I'm learning. We host these events, and we learn right alongside our participants here. And here we are in Maine, and here we are learning about forest ecology and climate change. And in Maine, what position is Maine in relating to forests when it comes to combating, you know, or to kind of positioning ourselves in a way to kind of have a positive impact on climate change? Because I never had really made that connection between photosynthesis before. I knew that it was stored, and I knew about the soil, but I don't know why it ever kind of slipped my mind to think back to photosynthesis. So we think about plants and cover, So where are we in Maine in our position where we're looking out our window and there are plants and trees all around us? Um, can you talk a little bit about that and just um, our resources here and how they position us in this conversation?
You want to take that, Sean?
Well, Jay, why don't I start out and then you can follow up? I would say in Maine, we're in really good shape. Maine is I think it's the most heavily forested state in the country. And our forests are, at the moment anyway, are generally healthy, right? Even our harvested forests generally are growing back. May not be the structure and the species we want, but they are growing back and sequestering and storing carbon. So if you look regionally or nationally, I would say Maine's in really good shape as far as our forests, the state of our forest in the context of climate change and climate change mitigation. Jay, can you add to that?
Yeah, I think, am I unmuted? Yeah. The one thing I was going to add is the School of Forest Resources. Some folks here recently did the state of Maine's carbon budget, which I'm not sure if everybody's familiar with. And once I can figure out where the chat box is, I'll link to it. But it talks about how important forests are for balancing out a lot of the emissions that we have in the state. And I think I was trying to pull up the number. I don't want to misspeak. It was something like more than half of the emissions that are released from the state in a year are then sequestered by the state's forest. So that's a really powerful role that our forests play that uniquely position us for this kind of climate carbon future that we're moving into, especially from the perspective when you talk to forest managers and silviculturalists that walk around the state and can find plenty of examples of forests that are not well managed and not well managed for carbon sequestration and storage, where we can do better. And so there's some estimates I've seen from the Forest Service, for example, that we can up that, I think, by 20 or 30% pretty easily just by adjusting how we manage our forests. So we have huge potential here in the state. I think that's part of why there's been big investments in improving our forest management.
That was what I was going to ask is there room for actually improvement? I mean, we're forested, yes, but are there points on which we should be learning and focusing our energy and efforts? And first thing that comes to mind is forest health. So as a landowner, a concentration perhaps on if someone were to have a woodlot or a piece of land, maybe perhaps a good place to start would be having a conversation with a forester and concentrating on improvement of forest health. Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely building in resilience strategies towards climate change and pests and disease and all of that. And lots of that comes down to some common sense things like building in some diversity in your forest management in terms of species composition, age class structures, thinking about how your forest is positioned in a landscape of other forests. Even if you have a small parcel, you can consider how that is integrated into a landscape around you and things. I certainly don't consider myself a forest manager, so I don't have like perfect strategies for how to think about that, but it's a lot of it is kind of common sense forestry in the sense that you manage to kind of hedge your bets in a lot of ways because we have a really uncertain future, which makes it really challenging to plan for and to know what to do when you walk out into your woods. But we do have some ideas and some guidelines as well, that stuff.
Carol, did you have something to add? I think, Carol, did you have something to add to this? I thought I saw you had a question.
Well, I can always add, but I didn't specifically have a question. I was just wondering, well, two things. You mentioned diversity in the forest, but are there certain species that are going to do better given our drier climate or hotter climate? And are there species that are better at becoming carbon pools?
Yeah, Sean, you'll know a little bit more about specifically the carbon pools of different species. I would say for thinking about which species to manage for, depending on where you are in the state, you might think about shifting away from some of these more boreal type tree species, in particular species like red spruce. But you can still bring in some of the iconic species that we love here in Maine. Like white pine is actually expected to do relatively well in a lot of places. Now it has its own diseases that it's struggling with in some cases as well. But that's a species that is expected to do okay in the relatively near term future. And then you can start thinking about bringing in oak, although then you'll bring in brown-tailed moth, which we're dealing with here in Orono right now. So there's a lot of contrasting management considerations, I think, that arise there. But shifting some places strategically away from some of those more boreal type species, or at least bringing in diversity into those stands that are purely boreal type species, hedges your bets a little bit as you move into that uncertain future. Sean?
Yeah, I can speak to Carol's question maybe without actually answering it, but and what I'm going to say might be a bit controversial, but why not stir things up a bit? I didn't cover this, but there are really two aspects to carbon. One is sequestration, which is the rate at which carbon is brought into the forest, and the other is carbon storage, which is simply how much is stored. So we could manage our forest to increase sequestration, that is, increase the rate of photosynthesis on a stand level, or we could manage for increased storage. We would manage for increased sequestration by having young forest. In other words, a forest that's recently been harvested and growing back rapidly is sequestering a lot of carbon. It's doing that relatively quickly. The other end of the spectrum, we could manage for old growth forests, which are storing an enormous amount of carbon in their large living and dead tissues. I would argue that in the balance, we should, if our goal is to optimize carbon management, I would recommend that we store carbon, forget the sequestration for a moment, just store carbon in large old trees. So Carol, to answer your question, we might ask what trees are long-lived and attain a large stature, right? And manage for those trees. What I'm saying doesn't preclude harvesting. We could still do some harvesting, right, in portions of the forest to increase that rate of sequestration. But again, in the balance, I think, and I don't think this is controversial. I think everyone recognizes that large old trees store more carbon than a small young tree.
So just roughly, at what age would a tree transition from being a sequesterer to a storer?
Well, good question. And maybe I misspoke. Even large old trees that continue to sequester carbon.
Yeah.
They might just do it at a lower rate than a vigorous, young, fast-growing tree. Yeah. So I hope that made some sense.
Some really good questions.
Yeah.
Does anyone else have any questions before we further our discussion on Friday evening, which hopefully many of you can still make the date? Sorry for the rain date change, but
I'll try. Thank you very much for this presentation.
Yes,
My daughter works for the Forest Society of Maine,
Oh, good.
so she keeps me informed about a lot of issues around forestry.
Glad to
And I
hear.
believe she graduated with a master's in your program.
That's good.
Excellent.
Masters.
Glad to hear it.
And she
All right, I
recently
don't
wrote
s-
an article called More Than the Market Value. You know, forests are much more than just what they're worth as milled wood.
Mm. All right, I don't see any questions, so I am going to stop the recording and thank our presenters once again. Thank you, Sean. Thank you, Jay. And we will see everyone, or hopefully most everybody, on Friday at the Law Farm starting at 5 p.m. We'll be doing a walk around the trails, further discussing. We'll be able to do some measuring and some apply some of the concepts that we learned here today. The Law Farm offers quite a diverse number of stands of forest. There's actually one section that's almost entirely blow down, so that will be really interesting to discuss. And I'm really looking forward to seeing some of you there and continuing these really great conversations with Jay and Sean. So thank you all again for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks
It was
for the
very good.
invitation.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you.
Thanks.